Good morning, everybody. My name is Tanya Rhodes Smith. Thank you for participating in today's webinar and for those folks who are with us live on voter turnout, political power, and community well-being. We're very happy to be here today. My name is Tanya Rhodes Smith, and I am the director of the Nancy A. Humphreys Institute for Political Social Work at the UConn School of Social Work. And I am an instructor in residence in their School of Social Work program. I've been an advocate for most of my career working with communities and political power, building political power and change in communities. So I'd like to introduce and have them introduce themselves, my great panel here.
Hi, my name is Mary Hylton, and I'm an associate professor at the University of Nevada, Reno. I've been working with Tanya in the Humphreys Institute for the last 3 years, going on the 4th year, to engage our students in voter engagement. In addition, I have a group of students who are working with me with the Campus Electoral Engagement Project this year to get out the vote on our local college campuses in Nevada.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Caleb Rodriguez, and I'm an employment specialist employed with the App Foundation in New Haven, Connecticut. I've been with them 24 years, and the populations that I serve have multiple barriers such as substance abuse, disorder, mental health, homelessness, and also ex-offenders. In addition to that, our vocational team is very, very active every year during election years, where we put together voter registration drives, and that's part of the reason why I've been asked to be here. In addition to working for the App Foundation, I'm also a licensed minister, and I'm very well connected with the faith-based community, and we also emphasize to our parishioners that it's important to be productive members of society, and going out, registering your vote, and casting your vote is a very good step in that direction.
Great. I am so excited to be presenting with both of them. As Mary said, we've been working together for the past 3 years, and her experience is invaluable to this effort. And Caleb is here, and he's got operationalizes all the work that we're going to be talking about today. So we encourage all of you to ask questions. And before I get started, I would really like to thank the Women's Consortium for hosting us today. Kathleen Callahan and Shannon Perkins put in a lot of hours to make this webinar happen, and so we're really thrilled, and Maggie Goodwin from NASW. So thank you to everyone who made this possible. And bear with us as we're doing this webinar for the first time together in Connecticut. Our objectives for today are to really talk with you about why voting matters to social work practice. It's intricately linked to our mission as social workers and our impact. So we're going to spend probably the majority of our time on that, and then also tell you a little bit about the national effort, the National Social Work Voter Mobilization Campaign. There's a national, social work has always had a long history in mobilizing people to vote. We are a political profession, but I want to talk to you a little bit about the campaign and the exciting things that are going on there. And then we'll talk more about how to make this work in your practice. How can organizations, social workers, NASW chapters, everybody integrate nonpartisan voter engagement into your practice, and what does that look like? So, and we'll share online tools and resources along the way. So we did our introductions. Let me say just a couple of words about the Humphreys Institute. Our mission is to increase the political participation and power of social workers in the communities we serve. Social work is a political profession. We're founded as a political profession, and our impact depends in the person and environment, depends upon our ability to shape public policy so that it reflects what we know about communities and working with individuals, and it reflects our professional values and our commitment to social justice. So we do this work so that public policy reflects that, and creating political participation is central to any kind of social justice, social change work. And I love Senator Barbara Mikulski said, politics is social work with power. So that's one of our favorite quotes here at the Humphreys Institute. So let's dive in on the importance of an inclusive democracy. An inclusive democracy is a democracy in which power is shared equally, and so it reflects and it responds to all people. I mean, right now, when we think about who participates in elections, we look and we see in state, local elections, we might see turnout of 1 out of 4 people turn out for a local election. State elections are slightly higher, and even in federal elections, we get excited when we get participation rates that are in 70, 80%, but we are not seeing a full turnout in any election. And what we know from the research is that elected officials pay attention to people and communities that vote. And I say that, I often stop and pause on that line. Elected officials pay attention to resources, or to communities and people that vote. I remind students when we talk to students that their voting record is public information. Anyone can Google your voting record to see whether or not you turned out in an election. So it's when you call an elected official, it is very likely that their staff will look you up. Are you a registered voter, and do you vote? And the research shows that. The research shows that more resources, that communities that turn out in higher numbers receive more resources and more attention from elected officials. So, and who votes in a community can often tell a really important story about who has power in that community. So when we look at, if you were to plot out in your community, I've worked in Bridgeport, Connecticut for much of my advocacy career, and you can tell, I know exactly which communities turn out. You can look across the state and see that even city to city, New Haven has a much higher turnout on municipal elections than Bridgeport or Hartford. So that also tells a story about who has gets more attention and within the context of a larger state. And you see that in Nevada too, don't you, Mary?
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry.
So Tanya and I were discussing this idea of how voting leads to representation, representation then in turn leads to resources and other outcomes in terms of policy. And an example that we were thinking about within the Nevada context, but is probably true in many states, is this idea of midterm versus presidential elections. And as we know, there are much higher voter turnouts for presidential elections than there are midterm elections. In Nevada, as with many other states, the state legislature has their elections every 2 years. So those elections that happen during the midterms frequently have a smaller turnout than those elections for state legislators during the presidential election. And as a result, the sessions that are represented, the legislative sessions, based on those elections look very different. So last session we had in 2017, we had a considerably more diverse legislature. It followed the presidential election. We had policies that were much more representative of women than we normally would have because we had a significant increase in women elected to office in Nevada. If we contrast that to the previous session that followed the midterms, we had far less diversity, far fewer women, and our policies were very draconian in terms of the attempt to circumvent people's rights, to lower resources and whatnot. So for folks to understand that connection of voting to representation and to outcome is very clear, and we can use those differing election results and turnouts to see it.
Great. So jump in anytime.
Here in Connecticut as well, we see that there's a lot more turnout for the presidential elections as well, in big contrast to the midterm elections. But one of the things that we discuss, especially in the field that I work in, is how important it is to go out and vote, because the services that we provide and many of the nonprofits throughout the state depend so much on funding. And if you all remember how long it took Connecticut, we were the last state to iron out a budget that has significant impact on services that are going to be given to disenfranchised people. So this is one of the reasons why we push so much the importance of going out and registering to vote.
Great.
What's the map on the right?
So the map here is, this is actually the city of Philadelphia, and it shows the turnout for that community. And if you were to do the same thing, and I encourage social workers and social services and students, we will often ask students to, in their community assessments to look at voting by district to see what the story of power is in their community. And just to go back to this idea of turnout, when you see low voter turnout, just to flip it, you think about 10% or 11% of the eligible population turning out for an election. That's a lot of power for a very small number of people. And not only do you have fewer people voting, and so a concentrated amount of power, you generally get fewer people running. So low voter turnout is it doesn't benefit anybody, and it creates actually a system that discourages participation rather than encourages it. And we'll keep coming back to this idea, and please let us know, and that was a great question. So the next aspect or way to look at this is voting is also a social determinant of health. So voting, and I will stop and explain the social determinants of health. Social determinants of health are all of the things that affect your health, that where you live, eat, work, play. It's that environment. So you think about a person and environment, it's all the things that affect us in our daily lives. And when you look at the research, it shows that 30% of our health is under our control. So our habits, our eating, our exercise, our sleeping, all of that has about a 30% influence on our well-being. The rest of it, the communities where we live, the environmental conditions of the communities that we live, the schools, the places where we hang out, if we live in a toxic environment where there's a lot of violence, all those indicators of our environment play into our well-being. And so who determines who shapes that larger context and where resources are spent? It's elected officials. So we get at it from this perspective. And actually, I use this one graphic on here that's from Alameda County in California because they're one of the few departments of health across the country that actually build in voting and voter engagement into their services and their strategic planning. And they not only do they look at voter turnout, but they actually compare it by communities, and they tie it to indicators of well-being like life expectancy and longevity and education. So they're looking at it as an indicator of health. But we can also say that there's a significant amount of research that communities that turn out have higher indicators of well-being in areas like health and mental health and employment. They bounce back from recessions faster. On the individual level, it's been shown to offset some of the effects of oppression, like discrimination. And there was a study that came out in January on young people that looked at voting and activism within young people. And voting turned out to be a really robust indicator of education and income for young people. So again, when we think about this act and practice of voting, it is an act of power for an individual and a community. And it's the practice of voting that we want social workers to look at. Again, we're not talking about who to vote for. We're talking about actually being an engaged, informed voter. Anything to add on that? Okay. I'm going to play a video for you now and talk about voting rights.
I just got registered to vote for the first time in 24 years. I'm feeling excited, and I'm happy for all the other felons that are able to vote now, because now we have a say-so in what goes on.
The governor of Virginia just granted 200,000 people with felonies the right to vote. Here in the capital of the old Confederacy, it's important to realize that this is a step towards racial justice.
All you have to do is fill out lines 1 through 6
Okay.
The last time you voted was
1992.
Wow.
Yeah, that's a long time.
Yeah.
I do know a lot of felons, and I've made sure that all of them know that they are able to vote this year.
I was incarcerated for 11 years.
So have you voted before?
No.
No.
Not even when I was 18, so I never got a chance to. They didn't bring ballots and registration people to the Powhatan Correctional Center.
How long were you not able to vote?
Since 2002,
Since 2002.
when I came home from the penitentiary. By me not having my right at first to vote, it hurts.
Felony disenfranchisement was written into Virginia's Constitution in 1902, and it was about white supremacy from the very beginning. The U.S. Senator who wrote the Constitution said that his greatest achievement was to, quote, eliminate the darky as a political factor in the state. Because of the 15th Amendment, delegates couldn't just bar black people from voting. Instead, they barred criminals from voting and made black people into criminals through aggressive enforcement of Jim Crow laws. The rest of Jim Crow's voter intimidation tactics are outlawed. There's no more poll taxes or a literacy test. But one vestige of Jim Crow still remains, and that's barring people with felonies from voting. It's not just a Virginia problem. Nationwide, 6 million Americans can't vote because they have a felony, and about 40% of those are black. About how many people do you register who this is their first time ever?
I've registered quite a few that said this was their first time. A lot of them didn't believe me. I still get people that say, really? And so when they tell me that, I take this out.
Take that out.
And then they believe, they'd be like, oh, okay.
The whole genesis of what we're talking about here today goes to the core of racism in this country. Many African Americans were being arrested early on in the southern states, so predominantly African Americans were the ones being charged with felonies. So the next natural extension would be, well, since we're arresting and charging all these African Americans with felonies, what an easy way for us to keep them out of the ballot box to say felons can't vote.
Now, Republicans say he did it just to get more Democratic voters. And the governor is a Clinton ally in a swing state. But no matter what the governor's motives are, the effect of the decision is a powerful reversal of the racism written into the state's constitution since Jim Crow.
A lot of people don't know what actually happened back at that time. And I remind the people of those things, and that's why it's so important now that you take advantage of this.
Oh, this was the capital of Confederacy. Let me come in, do what I do, serve you, master, but I can't vote, or I can't vote and put someone else in a seat that you don't deserve, master. I have to wait back. Finally, I got it. Now I can say who is going to do what for me and when.
At one time, I couldn't even speak because my voice wasn't able to be heard. You can hear me today because I have a right to speak out as being able to vote.
Mayors, senators, all those, they are people that we could have been voting on, and we never had the chance to because we were felons. Now we have the chance.
Come on, Auntie. Don't look at me, y'all.
Say hi.
That video is powerful every time I watch it. Anyone have any reactions? I don't know if you folks joining us online have anything you wanted to say before we start talking more about felony voting rights. And I should say that decision was made by the governor of Virginia. And Virginia is one of the states that permanently disenfranchises people from voting. And that executive decision issued by Governor McAuliffe in 2016 was overturned in the courts. And they had to manually or individually, I should say, restore voting rights to people with a felony conviction. And they did so, and I think it got up to about 180,000 or close to 180,000. But it's still being, it hasn't changed other than restoring the rights there. And I think this is a particularly powerful issue for social workers. And the reason I say that is Connecticut, for example, is not one of those states that permanently disenfranchises you. The University of Connecticut School of Social Work was very active in the early 2000s to change the laws. I mean, every state had really cumbersome waiting periods, and of all 50 states, they're all different. So the effect of having 50 states with 50 sets of rules means that most people don't know what their rights are. And what we find, even speaking with folks and social workers who work with the reentry population, that they often don't know what the rules are. So they don't know what the rules are, so they're not able to really help clients and communities know what the rules are. So on many levels, we think this is important. And just to emphasize and tie it back to the power of voting, there have been 2 studies that have shown that when you give people the right to vote back, so you restore voting rights, that reincarceration recidivism goes down in one study by 11%. So again, this idea that voting is power and has beneficial impacts just from the practice of voting, and we see that.
There is a comment from the webinar folks. The video is very insightful and powerful because it shows the humanity of the disenfranchisement as well as the fruit of helping folks find and use their political voice.
Great power.
This question, I think, for Mr. Rodriguez. What is the situation in Connecticut for felons?
Well, here in Connecticut, felons can vote as long as they've completed their incarceration and their parole, and if they've had any fines, and all those fines are paid for, they're eligible to vote.
But they have to re-register.
Correct.
And then in Connecticut is sort of falls within most states in our of the 50. I think it's 32, but don't quote me on it. But have some sort of restoration after you finish your incarceration, parole, or probation. But there are 2 states that don't take away your right at all. Can anyone think about what 2 states might allow you to vote from prison? Vermont? Very close by?
New Hampshire.
Close? Maine. So Vermont and Maine have never taken away the right to vote. So this is state by state. And in Florida, you lose is another one, and that's been in the news a lot lately, but in Florida is a permanent disenfranchisement state. And in states like Mississippi, you have almost 10% of the population that has been disenfranchised from voting. And when you think about the fact that this is disproportionately affecting communities of color, 1 in 13 African Americans has lost their right to vote versus 1 in 56 non-Black Americans, and that's from the Sentencing Project. I encourage anyone who wants to go a little deeper into this issue to go look at the Sentencing Project. And I'm going to ask Mary to talk for a second about Nevada because they've been going through some changes there, and I think those conversations are happening around the country, but it doesn't always mean that there's laws changing. I mean, you did change a bit in Nevada.
Yeah, Nevada has an incredibly complex policy for re-enfranchising folks who have felony convictions, and I won't get into the details of it because it's very contingent upon parole status, where they're at in it, probation. But what I did want to say is from more of a direct service point of view, and when my students are out working in the community to work with folks around voter engagement, what they have found is that folks who have any kind of criminal involvement in the past or convictions, even when they don't have convictions, but maybe have had charges, they find that a lot of folks believe that they don't have the right to vote without ever going any further to figure out what their rights actually are. And so one of the first steps that many of my students are taking now, and I think would be an important role for all of us in social work, is just to begin to educate people about what their rights are and let them know that they do have the right to vote, that they can regain that in states in which it was taken away, that there are some processes in place, and in helping them to actually engage in those processes. Another thing for us when we're in direct service to think about is there's a lot of efforts right now to intimidate people into not believing they can vote. So we've heard a lot of publicity around the woman, I think it was in Texas,
yep,
who was arrested for registering to vote when she didn't have the right to. We hear a lot of discussion of voter fraud when in fact studies are showing that there's very little evidence of voter fraud. But all this rhetoric is designed to intimidate people and to make them feel as though it's a risk to actually get involved in voting. And so I think that's something for us when we're working with people to kind of dispel those myths and help people engage.
I just wanted to clarify, Mr. Rodriguez, what you said. Say Joe gets sentenced, but he doesn't serve his entire time in prison. He has 10 years left. You know, he gets time off for good behavior, so he gets released 20 years of his 30-year sentence. Is he not allowed to vote for the next 10 years?
Good question. From the way I read it is the sentence has to be completed and off of parole. No?
Yeah, parole has to end.
Parole has
so
to end.
It's that status.
That status.
It's once parole ends. And if it was incarceration, it would be incarceration. So it doesn't necessarily mean of what you're sentenced. It's actually your status. So if you are incarcerated, and when you're actually walking out the doors to go into your parole status, you change from incarcerated to parole status, and then parole status to probation status. Those are distinct markers. So you have to know the rules in your state, and in Connecticut, it's the end of parole.
Okay.
And I'm talking because we've got a lot of folks from lots of different states here, so I encourage everybody who's joining us on the webinar to really look at this issue. And I want to make one other distinction, or two quick comments. One is that people who are in pretrial detention, this is across the country. If you are in pretrial detention, so you have not been convicted, and you don't have another felony event as well, you can vote by absentee ballot. And then I want to say that when you look at these voter registration forms, this act of intimidation, there are often, they threaten $5,000 penalties. And the woman that Mary mentioned in Texas, she was actually sentenced. She came out of prison, was looking to rebuild her life, reunited with her children, and her mother encouraged her to go vote in the 2016 elections. And she did. And she mistakenly voted while she was on parole, and she was sentenced to 5 years in prison for voting. So that is the maximum, that is what you can be sentenced. And that, as Mary said, that has a chilling effect on turnout. Who wants to risk that? So again, it's a space for social workers, and I'm going to, I encourage all of you. We have more resources at the Humphreys Institute and at votingisocialwork.org, and we'll talk more about that. So I want to take a quick few minutes for each of you to think about your own experience of voting and what it's like for your clients or community. You can think about your personal experience or the experience of your clients or your communities and what it's like to vote. And I want you to write down a couple of barriers to voting that you can think of. And this goes to all of you out there in the webosphere as well. Think about your experience voting and respond in Tenova about a couple of barriers that you can think of. And I'll give you just a couple minutes. All right, So does anyone want to share a barrier to voting that they could think of? We'll start in person and then we'll go out to those of you joining us through the internet.
For people with severe mental illness, a lot of times they lose their ID, and you really can't check in to vote without an ID, so I think I can see that being a barrier.
Voter ID is different in every state. We happen to be in a state in which you can vote without an ID, even if you have to sign a sheet verifying who you are. But yes, voter ID is definitely a barrier.
Just to go off of that, the voter ID, since we're talking about incarceration too, to not get an ID immediately upon release is a big issue.
And a proof of residency.
For everything.
Yep.
So I sit here and I can't think of a barrier. I was taught the value of voting and how important it was when I was young, and realized how privileged I am.
I think a barrier to voting is habit. And just when you're in the habit of doing something, you do it, and when you're not in the habit, it just is not a part of your routine. So I've seen people in my neighborhood that are just not in the habit. I work in a hospital. I see patients that are not in the habit. It's just, it seems like it's just for people to say like, oh, today is, today's the day I go to vote. They did it last year, they do it this year. And to me, the hardest thing is to break that first time, or the first, second, third time. And once it becomes a habit, it's easier to keep up with.
Yeah, I was actually going to say a different answer, but you made me think of something. When I was watching that film, something that I thought was very powerful was at the very end when she said to her daughter, oh, wave to the camera, look what mommy's got. And I think that voting is something that we can hand down to our children to educate them that this is something we do, that this is part of our family and part of our culture. And I think sometimes in different socioeconomic classes or in different cultures, it can be, I remember going to vote for the first time. It was very intimidating. I didn't know what it was going to look like. It was a little scary. And I came from a family that's very privileged. So I think that that was just a very powerful piece where teaching your child have access to vote. Anyway, I was going to say another barrier, but I'll give that to somebody else.
Well, being politically active or having conversations in your own home and seeing it in your own home is certainly one of the bigger predictors of being a voter out there. And I would remind you, too, that when we think about voting and barriers, we're thinking about it from our own perspective. And just in Connecticut, there are 169 towns, and I bet Nova has, we have a list we'll share, but what are you hearing from the folks out there?
Somebody listed a barrier as rural communities, voter sites far away from voters with limited transportation resources.
Yep. There are 900 fewer polling places in 2016 than there were in 2012. So transportation is definitely one of those issues. Anything else out there? So I'm going to share a few of these things.
I do want to just say something that was said before we started. Young people don't know where to get stamps.
You know what, there is an article about that, is stamps being a major barrier for absentee ballots and young people, that they actually aren't in the practice of mailing letters anymore. But this panel is going to run down a few of the barriers that we see and hear in communities. And you know, I can start us off, but folks often don't feel connected to their political system. It is not uncommon. I think there's a certain amount of misgivings about it, but most students and people in communities don't actually know who represents them. They're not even sure of who's a federal representative, who do you go to for federal issues, state issues, and local issues, because they just haven't been taught, or they haven't had that connection to the political system, and not knowing that not knowing who's on the ballot or who represents you is certainly a barrier. We talked, go ahead.
We have another comment. This is a bit of a longer one, but I'll say it. I live in a state with caucuses. We had huge turnout during what served as the primary caucus for the 2016 presidential election. This created massive barriers to access, not enough physical space in the caucus rooms, not able to access the building due to unavailability of parking, et cetera, et cetera. As a result of this experience in 2016, state law has changed and there will be primaries for future presidential election years. Caucuses offer an interesting process for democracy, but clearly the structure of caucuses relies on only a portion of eligible voters showing up.
That's a great comment, and for all of us who don't live in caucuses states to gain an insight on what that's like. I'm going to go through a few quickly, and maybe you can jump in and add a few, because, I mean, when we think about the barriers of not knowing when, where, or how to vote, those are significant. You mentioned it can be intimidating. I think finding your polling place can be very challenging, and they move it in some communities. The transportation issue we talked about, but if you have never been a voter or you are not comfortable with the system, not knowing when, where, and how to vote is really one of those things. All of these deadlines are different across the state. So Pennsylvania, the last day to register to participate in the election on November 6th is October 9th. That's a significant lead time. And in some states, you have same-day voter registration. So you can register and vote in the same day. In other states, you have early voting, and in some states, you don't. Some states, you can mail in your ballot from home. You know, so again, every state creates these systems that even for those of us who work in it, that all of you received a handout from the Connecticut rules front and back, but it's like that for every state. There's a lot to remember, and folks don't always know where to go to turn to get answers. I'm also going to run down a couple of things. Imagine you're working a job. You know, you've got kids. That add the transportation piece, not knowing where your polling place is, that you have to take a bus, that you show up and you're not on the list because you moved and you didn't realize you had to change. I mean, the process of voting is not actually very easy. For a lot of people, it's a significant challenge. We talk about physical barriers and access. How do you get to the polls? I mean, you know, you have a story about nursing homes. Do you want to share that story?
Sure. Yeah. So again, thinking of it from a social work perspective, and we've had our students actually engaging in their agencies to engage clients in voting. One of the more poignant stories one of the students came forward with is she was working in a skilled nursing facility, and she went room to room to talk to the residents there about voting and whether they were registered, if they wanted to get registered, how she could assist them in maybe getting absentee ballots. And she encountered a woman who was in her 80s who was legally blind and had moved to the facility probably, I think she said, about 4 or 5 years before. And this woman had told our student that she had voted her entire life, that voting had been an important part of her family culture, how she saw herself in her community. But once she got to the skilled nursing facility, they were so busy dealing with some of the other issues that resulted in her needing the skilled nursing facility, that voting was a forgotten issue. And so the fact that the student sat down with her and began to talk to her about it began to open the door to that loss that she experienced by being so disconnected from her community, that she lost something that was very meaningful to her. And through the course of this conversation, she became very emotional and let go of some of that grief around this. And so for our student, not only was she able to help connect her to the absentee ballot, she was also able to deal with her around some of the loss of being in a skilled nursing facility and losing the access to the independence and the things that help define you and your role in society. So I think knowing that a lot of our clients face these kinds of barriers. We had a lot of students who were working with an independent living program for people with disabilities, and they had to advocate to find ways to ensure that their clients could show up to the polling place and vote and be provided the accommodations that they are entitled to. So I think there's lots of barriers that we as social workers are uniquely geared to being able to identify and overcome.
That's right.
Similar barriers that we've seen has been where clients are talking about language barriers. There's a large Hispanic community, especially in Greater New Haven, and many times these folks are, of course, U.S. citizens and have the right to vote, and yet they don't know their rights, as well as how do I fill out these forms? Where do I get these forms? And when I do sign up, and if I do sign up, how am I going to get there? Where do I go to vote? And here in the Greater New Haven area, we're pretty much a very active community, and we're seeing more and more community services providing transportation in vans and numbers where folks can call and ask if they can be picked up and taken to a poll so they can go and vote. But that's something that we need to see more and more in other communities and other locations, because this is one of those barriers that it's just transportation and getting to those places to go and vote. We're seeing more and more it being one of the biggest obstacles. I want to just also jump in and say, according to some of the comments that you made regarding the video, my parents came to this country from Puerto Rico, being U.S. citizens, but only with an 8th grade education, and worked really hard to instill in us the importance of being, productive members of society and being, responsible citizens. And something that they instilled in us was, how that starts is register to vote. As soon as you're able to, register to vote and go and make your voice be heard. And it's something that I embraced, my siblings have embraced, and that's something that I'm instilling in my children. My sister makes it a point to go work for one of these agencies that provides transportation, and it's nonpartisan. She tells me I go help and volunteer and work, and people call, and I set up rides for them to go vote. I don't tell them who to vote for, what party to swing for, etc. Just go out and cast your vote. And more, she's very happy to be able to set people up with rides to go and vote.
So, can I add one more thing? So, you had mentioned that influence of culture, and Tanya had mentioned that there is a lot of research that does show that one of the biggest influences on people's voting patterns as they age is actually their childhood experiences of voting and whether or not their family did. So if you go into communities where large segments of the community are disenfranchised from the vote, either through felony convictions or through immigration status, then you have entire generations of children who are not growing up around in a culture of voting, right? Not because their parents don't believe in it, not because it's not valued, but it's simply because of the nature of the community in which they live. And so that's another way in which I think social workers can identify that barrier and be pivotal in helping those younger generations connect with voting in a way that maybe isn't happening in the most direct way within their homes.
Agreed. And sometimes it's not even legally disenfranchised, that you're marginalized from communities or from the government, and in some of these, the way that we treat people, and that we, in our history, our very short history of voting rights, I mean, we don't have to go back really that long. There are two quick populations I want to mention here quickly, and that's the homeless. I want you all to know that homeless people have a right to vote, and they can vote in all 50 states. They have the right to register where they lay their head. So that may be a shelter, that may be a park, it may be a corner, but they have the right to vote. I want to make that clear. And also survivors of domestic violence. There are programs in all 50 states that allow for survivors of domestic violence to to get a different address from their own. And usually it's run out of the state's attorney general's office, but most domestic violence clinics and places that work with that population know where to go, or your Secretary of State's office. So those are two very important groups that I wanted to make sure I mentioned. And, this idea of never being asked, as we talk about marginalization, the power of being asked is really important. And political parties and candidates tend to ignore non-voters because we know your voting record is public. Political candidates have a limited amount of money and they want to win an election. So they are going to target people that are already voters, generally. Some will go out in the larger universe to register, but oftentimes you're targeting voters and you're targeting people that are likely to turn out for your candidate. So there's this whole group of people that have really never been formally asked. And voting has a lot to do with relationships and having conversations and having somebody believe and tell you that your vote matters. And that's one of the biggest barriers. So when we look at all of this together, we see that many of these barriers are structurally designed, and many of them are discriminatory in their intent or their effect on certain populations, and that they don't have to be this way. So I just want you all to see that we make this process of voting. My experience voting in my town is driving up to the polls, parking my car, plenty of parking, I walk in, and it's a 5-minute exercise. In the next town over, it can be an hour long or an hour and a half. I mean, we have two cities just in Connecticut alone where one didn't have ballots as late as an hour after the polls opened, and one where they ran out of ballots in 2010. So, again, it's run by individual communities, and your experience could be very, very different from someone else's. And I want you to think about this from a systems perspective. So I have this slide up here, and think about all the ways that we can do this. And one slide that we've talked a little bit about the registration process and how in North Dakota you don't even have to register to vote. Now in Connecticut we have automatic voter registration through DMV, the Department of Motor Vehicles, but that doesn't necessarily capture everybody. So look at your state individually, look at these opportunities and how we can make it easier for folks. The knowledge piece of when, where, and how to vote. That's something that social workers, agencies, and communities can help people with. And schools. I mean, that's fundamentally important to going out and being a voter. And one of the bigger issues for most clients, and probably most of you, is where do you find out about the candidates and who's on the ballot? How do you know who currently represents you, and then how do you know who's on the ballot? And that is lacking in many communities. The League of Women Voters does an amazing job across the country and is, I think, a respected resource for most communities. But those guys that we used to have in the newspaper when everybody used to get the newspaper aren't always there anymore. And especially when you get down to local candidates. So when I look across Connecticut, for example, you might have online resources available for some communities, but then in others, and I'll give you, Hartford, there's no online resource to look up who's on the ballot from top to bottom. And so, again, thinking about creating not just consistent voters, but informed voters, those are structural opportunities for us as social workers and advocacy. So we think about this entire thing and how do we actually change community norms. And that's really if we can talk about this in all the places and spaces that people live, work, and play. And, social services are a big part of that. Social services meet people where they are. They are trusted to give this kind of information. They have people's best interests at heart. We don't want to be registering somebody who is ineligible. Somebody who is not a U.S. citizen can be put in harm's way and have their citizenship application derailed because of inadvertently registering to vote. So again, these are important issues and frankly really important space for social workers to be in. And we've already been talking about these other elections, but when I talk to students, the importance of municipal elections, really, this is municipalities. not only can they be sort of nurturing, or they can be sort of on the forefront of federal policy when we think about same-sex marriage or marriage equality or drug laws. I mean, sometimes municipalities are ahead of the curve and ahead of federal policy, drug policy being one of them. But less than 1 in 4 people votes in a municipal election, and those elections matter. And talking about areas when we think about clean drinking water and local environmental hazards and even policing policy. You know, it's very powerful when you go back and look at Ferguson, Missouri, when Michael Brown was shot, and we saw, you know, a community that was 70% African American with a nearly all-white city council, and a 12.9% turnout for the last municipal election, and that was creating municipal policy and raising revenue through traffic stops that disproportionately targeted minority drivers. So again, you know, municipal policy often has, you know, profound impacts on daily lives, and it's the least likely to get people out there. Most people don't even know when there is a municipal election. So again, this is something that we can help with. And I'm being mindful of the time because I really want to spend a good amount of time on Q&A and diving into some of the work that Caleb and Mary are doing in their communities. You know, again, I love this cartoon because it really emphasizes the fact that when one of the major reasons people don't vote is because they don't think their vote matters. Not only internally, but they actually don't think, you know, and that can be from from districts that are too safe. They feel like, oh, well, it's going to be, you know, it's going to be this party or that party anyway, so it doesn't really matter, forgetting the fact that many elections are, you know, decided by one vote. The entire Virginia legislature was flipped by a coin, you know, coin toss. So you know, again, who turns out matters, and that is particularly important in the state and local races. And, you know, social workers can do this work. We can be doing the registration process. And I want you all to start thinking about how that might look for you. But we can help with registration. We can help with education, so connecting people. You don't have to be the expert. You can just be partnering. You should know what the resources are in your community. You can understand that making voting easier for all people and expanding voting rights is good for communities. I want Connecticut to be the 3rd state that doesn't take away voting rights from people who are incarcerated. I really do. I think that we could also be expanding early voting, and, you know, we've got some really good pro-voting policies in our state, but we could be better. And there are some states out there with some really terrible pro-voting policies, so they could be better too. And then social workers, encouraging people to go out and vote. Your vote matters, you know, and getting people to the polls, connecting them with all of those things. You doing this one?
Yes, I think so. All right, so one of the things we've been stressing with our students and in the work with Humphreys Institute is that voter engagement, when it's nonpartisan, is legal, ethical, and professional. And this is something that's sometimes hard for folks in agencies to understand or come to terms with. The reality is, as long as social workers or agencies aren't in any way making partisan pushes towards their clients, as long as they're not endorsing folks or asking for money or resources, in any way coercing people to take a position in alignment with a certain party or belief or candidate, they can help their clients to get involved in voting, to engage them in voting. In fact, it's actually required for certain agencies to do so. So some of you might be familiar with those agencies, but there are federal laws that require any agency that's delivering certain welfare benefits, including TANF, I think WIC, to make voting registration available to the clients at the time that they're receiving services. So not only is it ethical and legal, it's actually required in certain settings. The ethical part, if you look at the Code of Social Work or the NASW Code of Ethics, at the very back we have Section 6, which refers to social workers' responsibility, ethical responsibility to the larger society, and this is typically where we think of the social justice ethics. And in there is a caveat that says that social workers should facilitate the informed involvement of their communities and their client groups in political processes. So our ethics are calling us to do this. The law allows us to do this. We just have to believe that it's our role to do it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is anybody who's registering people for TANF, WIC, food stamps, or Medicaid. So you might be doing that in a nonprofit setting, but all the law says is that you have to offer the opportunity to register people to vote. Putting forms out on a table is not really engaging voters.
Actually, and I have a little bit more on that. The state of Nevada actually was sued for not doing this piece of it well, not following the federal law, and they lost because we didn't, in our welfare agencies, didn't do enough to encourage people to engage in voting.
Great, and we are going to, what we want you to do is to think about social work and the services, and frankly, any social services that are out there, shift from being that helping mindset to really that empowerment mindset, because that's where community change comes. That's participant-driven change, and when we fail to see the political power and the political potential of our communities that we serve to be the drivers of change, you know, we fail to see all the things that they can do for themselves. You know, it's basic strength-based. I do have one question from the webosphere, but I want to clarify something about your voting record being public, because I did say that, and it is. You can Google your own voting record, but what you will see is whether somebody is registered and which elections that they actually turned out in. You do not see who they voted for. So I do want to make sure, because who you vote for is 100% confidential. Some of us might be a little more transparent about that than others, but it is 100% confidential. So I'm going to actually stay on this slide, and I want to go back to give you all about 30 or 60 seconds to think about how you might operationalize this idea of nonpartisan voter engagement. So if we define that as the registration piece, the education piece, so when, where, how do you know, and then, you know, how do I vote in my interest, connecting them to candidates, and the outreach. What are some things that you can do in your practice? And I'm talking to all of you out there in the internet as well. Share a way that, or one or two ways that you think that you can integrate this into your social work practice. And then we'll ask you to share it. So take about 30 seconds. And we'll operationalize it a little more, but see what's coming to you. All right, anyone have an idea of something that they can do to support clients or communities to vote?
Here at the Connecticut Women's Consortium, we host a lot of large events. So for example, last Friday we had over 300 people at an event. We actually had Chris Murphy there, and we could have easily added it into our intro script to say something about it. So, you know, for our events coming up between now and Election Day, or up to the point where people can register, we can put something into our opening remarks at our events to remind people who aren't registered to vote. It could be that simple.
That's fantastic. Absolutely.
Thank you. I was thinking that people that are working in clinical agencies, one of the first things you can do is check supervision and talk about is it something that we can do possibly during intake when we're doing the biopsychosocial and checking everything else. Are you a registered voter? Mm-hmm. Would you like some information about that?
That question can also be really informative, because you can learn something about somebody when they say that they're, whether they are or aren't registered to vote. And an example I'll give you is from someone here at NASW, at Maggie Goodwin, who's fairly instrumental in making this today's program happen. But she learned through that intake question that somebody had a felony conviction from 25 years ago that they had never told anybody about. They were ashamed about it and it probably wouldn't have come up. They talked about it. He was elated and actually really proud to register to vote once he knew that he could. So again, it's another layer. We ask people whether they're veterans. We ask them about depression. We ask them even if they're anxious because of the current political climate. So, you know, again, it's a great idea to talk to folks. Anyone else?
This is a conversation I'm actually having with young people that I'm working with right now. I do a lot of reproductive and sexual health education, and you know, a lot of that stuff is under fire. So having conversations with them and trying to empower them that if they register to vote, that they could make a difference, especially when it comes to peace and protecting their health, because a lot of the entities and providers that they utilize are under fire. So
that's right. You know, it's really interesting because some groups, some organizations really tie voting to their mission. You know, if you are working in reproductive rights, you know, we know that large organizations like Planned Parenthood actually have two arms. They have the nonpartisan registration arm, and then they have the non-501c3, the 501c4 arm that really works to get out the vote and actually holds candidates accountable for their votes. So, you know, there are ways to engage voters, and it's part of their mission. Anyone else? All right, well, let's go through a few ideas. All of you have the fact sheet, and we'll spend just a couple of minutes about that, and then we'll open this up for Q&A, because I hope that all of you will think about how you will do things differently as a result of this training. But we already mentioned the first one. Do any of you work in schools? Through your work in reproductive rights. So we get a lot of social workers who are placed in schools, and many times when I say, well, how can schools support people to vote? And they'll say, well, it's an elementary school, elementary students can't vote. Well, first of all, back in my day, we used to vote in school in presidential elections, and it was a really big deal for all school elections, and it really gave me an opportunity to learn in the old, those old polling things, machines that we used to use. But I digress. But schools have fantastic communication networks with parents. I get text messages all the time from my kids' schools. I get email blasts. I get PTA notices. It would be very easy for schools to do the when, where, and how to vote piece, and to connect people and remind people when there are primary elections. Again, these smaller elections that are municipal, I don't know how they're run in Nevada, but our primaries are in August or September. People aren't really thinking about voting, particularly on races that are not presidential races. And just the idea of sharing who your elected officials are, where your polling place is, and reminding parents of when the deadlines are. So I think that there's a really important role for schools, and we talk about community culture.
And that reminds me of, you know, when I was in elementary school, there was a lot of education. When I was in elementary school, there was a lot of education about the dangers of smoking, and both of my parents smoked. And when, you know, the three of us would come home and say, you know, this is what they said in school, I mean, there was a lot of upward peer pressure from us to our parents, and they did both quit smoking. I don't know how much of an effect we had on it, but, you know, we refused to get in the car with them if they were smoking. So I can imagine that a lot of peer pressure about smoking could also move upward from elementary school kids. Absolutely.
So I think that there's a great role for schools, and as Mary said, I mean, you know, we know that that works. I want to say something about voter registration status, and I don't know in Nevada whether you can check someone's address when you're checking their voter registration status. In Connecticut, you can't check their address. So know what your state is. I can look up to see that I am a registered voter in a particular town, but I don't see the actual address. And I bring that up because for highly mobile communities and people who move a lot, knowing that they're registered at their current address could actually save them a lot of time and hassle on the back end. So vote.org is one of those tools that I find really helpful. And I think this, again, when we're thinking about when to meet, where to meet people on this issue, whether it's an intake, who can help them look up their registration status? Do you want me to help you right now? It literally takes a minute to look it up. And so you can save them a lot of time and hassle, because there's nothing worse than showing up to the polling place and not having your name on the list when it should be. We've already talked a lot about felony convictions, homeless, making sure that everybody knows that their vote matters and to get them represented. Sharing information and voting tools with people. You know, again, find partners in this work, and Mary's going to talk a little bit in a few minutes about partners, but there are really good partners, and I'm going to mention one that actually isn't on our list in the next slide, but TurboVote. TurboVote is one of those tools. There are some great ones out there, so I'm just highlighting one. But TurboVote, if you go to their website and you put in your email address or your cell phone number, you get reminders. So I got a text message 30 days before my special election in my town. I thought I might cry right there on the spot. It was really an exciting moment for me. And then the email that I got from TurboVote told me where to go when the election was, where to go vote, where my polling place was. So, you know, these kinds of tools will become more prevalent, but you have to sign up for them. And I think, you know, we have to sort of encourage people to use them to build community capacity and to really get them out on election day. Any other questions? Do we get any? Okay. These are a list of a few things. I want to stop here because we've given you more on the handout. We've got 10 ways that agencies can make a difference. You will integrate this into your practice in whatever way works for you, because all of you meet clients where they are. But we do want to say a few things about the next one. I want to just address the fact that this is part of a national effort to integrate this into social work practice. The National Social Work Voter Mobilization Coalition is a group of educators, and I am one of them. I'm working with Dr. Mimi Abramovitz and Dr. Terry Mizrahi and Dr. Beth Lewis. The first are at Hunter. Dr. Lewis is Director of Field at Bryn Mawr. And what we are doing is trying to say to all students and to all schools is that this should be part of social work practice. And we've been endorsed by the Council on Social Work Education. We've been endorsed by a long list of folks that you can see here. But this is, we've been working with NASW very, very closely to show social workers how to integrate this. And we have a great resource for you called www.votingisocialwork.org. Easy to remember, and it's on your fact sheet. But all of the slides for today, the video, articles, research, annotated bibliographies, letters you can use, we keep posting more things. We're going to keep making it better, and so that you don't have to be the experts, but you know where to go. Oh, sorry, that's the wrong thing here.
So one of the easiest things for you to do, and that can be most facilitative of this work, is to find a partner who's already doing voter engagement within the community. So we've got a list here for you, but I encourage you to think about context specific, like who is doing this work in your community, who is out there already. Within the state of Nevada, there are a number of community organizations that received very sizable grants to engage in voter engagement. So when we have projects that our students are doing in the community, they frequently will go through our partners and involve them. And I'll give an example. We had some students who were working in a reentry program for folks who had been released from prison, and it was a residential program, and the residents were required to attend a life skills class every evening, and so the students worked into their life skills classes some issues on voting. So they did 3 sections on it. The first one, they involved the ACLU, and they had the ACLU come and explain voting rights and how to have them restored. The second session they involved one of our local community organizations, it's called the Progressive Leadership Alliance of Nevada, who was doing work on restoring rights. And so they had raised some money, and they had some attorneys that were working with them that could help restore rights. So the second session was devoted to that. And the third was devoted to looking at the current elections and what the issues of concern would be for the folks who were attending the group. So just to give you an example, it seems daunting to take on this work in your agency setting on your own. But again, a lot of this is already being done out in the community. It's being a good social worker, knowing how to network and broker, and getting the right people to the right conversations at the right time.
Caleb, can you talk a little bit about who you partner with and how this sort of evolved in your agency? Because I know you've been doing it for some time.
How this came about was when an election year came around, we started hearing clients making comments, asking questions, etc. And it sparked an idea in our director's mind, and my director brought it up to our vocational team, and the vocational team absolutely jumped all over it and said, we would be more than glad to spearhead a voter registration drive in all of our clinics. And to give you an idea, the App Foundation in New Haven, I just recently learned this myself, and I've been with the company 24 years. We're the 6th largest employer in the city of New Haven. And we have two clinics in New Haven, as well as a central medical unit. We have now a residential program that used to be in Bridgeport, is now in New Haven. We have a clinic in North Haven, not too far from here, from this location. And we also now have a brand new clinic in the city of West Haven. So we have gone ahead, and we used to, the way we started was we would promote and send out flyers to all of our clinics and post posters all over our clinics, as well as emails, and say that at such date, we would set up a date that we would be stationed at every clinic at a particular room that we would designate, and 1 or 2 staff members from the vocational team, as well as a couple of the staff members from the clinical team, would be in that room providing the information as well as the registration forms, both in English and Spanish. And we would make sure we had bilingual people as well, ready to inform any monolingual Spanish-speaking people how to go about filling out the forms. And it would be, again, nonpartisan. We would have to all be neutral, and we would train the staff. One of the things that I do as an employment specialist, we teach interviewing skills, the importance of body language, facial expression, etc. So if a client came up and made certain comments regarding a candidate or a party, etc., while they wanted to come and register, we would keep a neutral facial expression and say, that sounds very interesting. Those comments are very, very interesting. That's exactly why we're here today. We want you to go ahead and register to vote so that you can go and make your voice be heard and not be pro or against or show any type of leniency toward any side. And that's something that we emphasize on, and the importance of doing it that way. Because again, as we said in one of the slides earlier, it's important, even though we're nonprofit, we're not, we don't promote WIC or anything like that, or sign people up for WIC, but we make sure that we do it in a nonpartisan way. And clients really appreciate that. And I can go back to that video and relate so much to the expressions of the folks that you saw in the video, their reaction when they find out that not only they can register the vote and go vote, but after they finish completing the registration form, the elation, the joy, and the satisfaction of just knowing, wow, I can't wait till election day. And another thing that we do is that we make sure that they understand where they can go to find out where their polling location will be. And we also encourage them regarding transportation, because a lot of times within our agency, many of our clients get bus passes and they get transportation assistance. So we encourage them to make sure that they can find a way to their poll location. And we also encourage them, if they belong to a mosque or a synagogue or a church in the faith-based community, many of their locations also have vans and buses, and sometimes their ministers or their clergy will be open to the idea of lending transportation with their vehicles for an election. And again, many folks won't know that unless they ask. And there's nothing wrong with asking. It's a yes or a no. And many times they make it available because they see the importance of it. Many clergy are going to agree to it because they say, yes, we are also promoting it. I know we do at our church, and we promote it and encourage our parishioners to register to vote, go out and vote, and be part of the big picture. And when a van is available, we make it available for election day as well.
That's great.
I have two questions for Professor Smith. One, I was looking through the materials. I wasn't aware, so I just want to make sure I understand it correctly. Connecticut has same-day registration. If you're unregistered, you can just show up at the polls and vote, and that vote is counted, or is it provisional?
No, it's counted. And let me clarify for everyone across the country, for those states that do have same-day voter registration. In our state, it's not same day. You don't go to your polling place. There's a designated spot that's usually different in the 169 towns. And so you have to know where to go to register and vote same day. But you also don't have the same rights as a non-registered person going. So if you are in line, and this is across the country, if you are in line when the polls close, you are entitled to vote. But if you are not registered yet, so you're in the line, and in Bridgeport, it can be 2 hours to register and vote on the same day. You don't have that same right. So at 8 o'clock, if you are in line for the same day voter registration, you're not given the opportunity. So it is not provisional. It is actually voting, registering, and voting in the same day.
And my second question is regarding people that have moved.
Mm-hmm.
So say you move, but you don't change your voter registration, and it's been 6 months. What's the situation with that in Connecticut?
Well, you're really supposed to be registered to vote where you live. You know, I have heard stories of people going back to their old communities to vote, but really, if you're not living in that community, you really don't have a right to participate in their elections.
Even if it's just like
down the street?
Yeah, you switch sides of a town or something. You're in the...
But you're still in a different district, so you're not voting. You know, you're not participating in the election for your district and your elected representatives. So I encourage everybody to change their registration. We are just about out of time here. I did want to say one quick thing. We got a great comment encouraging social workers to actually participate in elections. So not just in helping people to vote, but actually working at the polls. At the Humphreys Institute, as I said, we have social workers. We believe that social work is best when we have both arms, both our micro practice and our macro practice. And many social workers specialize in political, working in political settings. But all of you can work in elections. You can be poll monitors. You can volunteer to drive. And being a part of the process itself, we always say that every social worker should be involved in elections in some way. So I think we're out of time. All of you are going to receive a link to participate in in a study. We're a university. We often, not only do we evaluate this training, but it's really important to us to look at the political participation and attitudes of social workers and social work practice. So you're getting an anonymous link, and those of you in the room will be doing it differently, but you get an anonymous, it's an anonymous poll. You will be informed of your consent when you get it. Thank you very much for joining us.